Fascisti did not belong to the multitude of flops and skeptics who mean to belittle the social and political importance of women. Benito Mussolini. To this day, most people do not make the connection between fascism and feminism, let alone imagine that there were feminists that joined the fascist movement. Suffragettes even, well-known suffragettes in the 20th century, like Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. Emmeline being the founder of the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, who is credited to this day for being a key figure in getting the women's vote in Britain. Today, there are many basement dweller misogynists who would have a bone to pick with the 20th century fascists. Fascism was not an extreme version of conservatism, like many like to imagine. They, in fact, were a lot more pragmatic when it came to women's roles and their talents than most of the conservative politicians at that time. In an article by Slate titled, quote, "Why Former Suffragettes Flocked to the Fascist Movement," the writer contradicts the idea that many will probably use as an explanation, that these women were manipulated or that they had, quote, internalized misogyny or they were of weak mind. No. Instead, he writes, quote, "In explaining the motivation that led women into fascism, it would be erroneous to dismiss them as being either misguided or manipulated. Many joined for reasons that had little to do with their gender. Middle and upper class women from conservative backgrounds were reacting against conventional politics for the same reasons as men." There's also a very strong reactionary sentiment against the forces of communism. Fascism with women involved was happening all over continental Europe, including Spain, Italy, and Britain, which I will mostly focus on in this video. In Spain, there was La Sección Femenina under the leadership of Pilar Primo de Rivera, which attracted many feminists that were against the communist threat and were attracted as well by the community service for the country. In Italy, Margherita Sarfatti, a former socialist and former art critic, became a close associate of Mussolini and played a role in promoting fascist culture. Spanish fascism, Italian fascism, and British fascism all had strong feminist factions. Did the fascists overall hold more traditional gender roles? Yes. Were they more extreme and black and white with gender roles than conservatives were? No. Two factions of feminism, at least in the eyes of the nationalists, were formed in the 20th century. But these nationalist groups called healthy feminism and vain feminism. Vain feminism is the form of feminism which has won over modern times, while the other strain has been largely forgotten or ignored after the Second World War. Vain feminism was, in their eyes, in the eyes of the nationalists, a form of individualistic and self-serving feminism, a feminism that steered women away from families and to serve no one but themselves. Healthy feminism was viewed to be a type of feminism which would have women serve their families and the state and country by utilizing their talents. So first, let's talk about Italy. La donna fascista, the fascist woman, the ideal woman, in fascist ideology at least, was a woman who served her family in motherhood, but also participated in society for the good of the country. In 1923, Mussolini attended the first women's fascist conference in Padova, and he said in his speech, "Fascisti did not belong to the multitude of flops and skeptics who mean to belittle the social and political importance of women. What does the vote matter? You will have it. But even when women did not vote and did not wish to vote in times past, as in times present, women had always a preponderant influence in shaping the destinies of humanity. The women of fascismo, who bravely wear the glorious black shirt and gather around our standards, are destined to write a splendid page of history, to help with self-sacrifice and deeds Italian fascism." Before fascism, the condition of women in Italy had not been part of government policy. And many of the women who joined fascism did so because they believed there would be greater gender equality, at least in the recognition of their contributions to society, which previously had not happened. Fascist maternalistic policy in Italy included protection and guarantee for maternity, loans for married couples and newborns, career preferences for parents of large families, institutions of health and federal assistance for the family and childhood, some of which had not been achieved even to this day with liberal policy. In 1919, the first fascist manifesto published in Il Popolo d'Italia promised the female vote, which did not exist in Italy until then. In 1925, the Fascist Party in Italy granted the women the right to vote in local and regional elections, which you might think is simply not enough. Why not the national vote? But you gotta consider the historical context. Women did not get full rights to vote in Italy until 1945. There's no turning back the clock. Now, let's talk about British fascism. Oswald Mosley's fascism, a man who declared himself a feminist. You can choose to believe him or not, but this should be a reminder that the wants and needs of feminists back then and even to this day are not exactly all white across the board. The fascists themselves recognized that when they made designations for two different types of feminism. England was the most pragmatic of all when it came to gender roles and the roles of women. In fact, at some point, the BUF, the British Union of Fascists, boasted the highest percentage of female candidates for office, higher than any other party. The fascist movement led by Mosley was very welcoming to women in practice, although in the face of it, it did not seem that way, and that's probably how we look at it today. Orthodox conservatives and fascists both believed in gender roles, don't get me wrong. They believed in them for the stability of the family and the nation. There's no denying that. But the fascists were a lot more pragmatic and state-centric than the conservatives. There was more recognition that women had roles in the public space. In fact, there was a belief that underutilized talents would not just go to waste, but instead that energy would be diverted elsewhere in destructive ways for both men and women. For women, this could manifest in a sort of home tyranny, which actually many children of the 60s could tell you they experienced with their mother, or neuroticism, even what Betty Friedan described in the 60s in her book, The Feminine Mystique, by the problem that could not be named. That uneasiness and restlessness that many women experience while living at home. Alexander Raven Thompson and Anne Brock Griggs, both members of the BUF, said that under the BUF that the corporate state would give women greater privileges than they enjoyed under democracy, at least the democracy at the time, by ensuring proper representation for them as housewives. Additionally, the corporate system would raise their status as workers by ensuring that they enjoyed equal pay, by increasing remuneration in low-paid occupations, and by abolishing the marriage bar restricting the employment of married women. The rationale for all of this lay not in promoting women's individual rights, but in serving the interests of the state by making full use of women's skills. So I found this all very interesting because I had been under the illusion all this time, and I bet most people are, that fascists were more forceful and extreme when it came to their rigidity to keeping women at home. Mosley, in fact, said, quote, "Without the women, I could not have gotten a quarter of the way." The women's section was established by his own mother in March of 1933, Lady Maud Mosley. In the book Fascism, 100 Questions Asked and Answered, which you can find on Amazon, Mosley was asked, would women be eligible as representatives in all corporations, on any corporations? And he answered, they will be eligible for all corporations representing their industry or profession. In addition, the great majority of women who are wives and mothers will for the first time be given effective representation by fascism. A special corporation will be created for them, which will have special standing in the state. The corporation will deal with outstanding women's questions such as mother and child welfare. In addition, it will assist government in such matters as food prices, housing, education, and other subjects in which the opinion of a practical housewife is often more than that of a socialist professor or spinster politician. Another question he was asked, question 32, will the position of women be in any way inferior under fascism? He answered, certainly not. Fascism in Britain will maintain the British principle of honoring and elevating the position of women. We certainly combat the decadence of the present system, which treats the position of wife and mother as inferior. On the contrary, we consider this to be one of the greatest of human and racial functions to be honored and encouraged, but women will be free to pursue their own vocations. Fascism combats the false values of decadence, not by force, but by persuasion and example. Again, you might choose to believe him or not, but like Mussolini, Mosley had a disdain for strict cultural conservatism. The writer of Slate article notes that himself. The article states, Sir Oswald Mosley's immediate appeal consisted in his economic program, a marriage of Keynesian ideas for stimulating domestic demand, and a policy of economic autarky influenced by the example of the United States, with its huge home market insulated from the fluctuations of the world economy. While this radical social economic program was Mosley's chief draw, he never concealed the fact that signing up to fascism also involved a rejection of Britain's traditional political system, which was, quote, devised to turn a man into a windbag in the shortest possible time. Some of the BUF's official standing on women's issues included the following 10 points. Women having representation in parliament, legalistic equality for women, equal pay for equal work, the right to work and vote, improvement of working conditions for women, removal of all sexual discrimination, support for health and maternal infant welfare, affordable housing for families, free nursery schooling and free higher education, and affordable food supply for families. The BUF's perspective diverged from traditional conservative views that often relegated women strictly to domestic roles without political recognition or occupational categorization. The Slate article also recognized that Britain's BUF had the highest number of female candidates, as I mentioned before, at the time in comparison to other political groups. And as I said previously, many of Britain's suffragettes were drawn to the fascist movement. Many because they had become disillusioned with the state of politics at the time. Again, quoting from Slate, Dorothy Down, Nora Ellem and Mercedes Barrington, for example, had worked for the Tory party but simply grown disillusioned. However, several female fascists had once been active suffragettes, including Mary Richardson, notorious for slashing Diego Velázquez's Roque Viñas at the National Gallery in 1914, and Mary Allen, who had pioneered the women's police force during the First World War. Mary Richardson explains, quote, I was first attracted to the black shirts because I saw in them the courage, the action, the loyalty, the gift of service, and the ability to serve, which I had known in the suffragette movement. The female fascists wore a black shirt, a black beret, and a gray skirt. All of this is happening in the early 1900s. Remember, a lot of Europe, including the UK, had a marriage bar where married women were not allowed to participate in many jobs. In some ways, the BUF was ahead of its time. They did not succeed in Britain, but eventually the marriage bar would be abolished much, much later. This is not at all a sponsor to this ideology, but I find it important that we are able to poke holes through history, through the stories we have been told, to talk about things which do not exactly fit, even if they are inconvenient. We have all heard the phrase, History is written by the winners. But sometimes it seems that most people are not really willing to consider what that means. Historical fractions and ideologies are not always all bad or all good. There are shades of gray, and often it seems the winning side demonizes what came before them or what they defeated. And often, for fear of controversy, people are not willing to look at the whole picture. So consider that next time someone is questioning an event of the past or the present or an ideology. And consider subscribing. I'll see you next week, and cheers.